The priests of Egypt, always impostors but once so celebrated, had now degenerated into a race of jugglers. Also the Chaldeans lived upon the fame of their fathers, and upon their own base trickeries. The Brahmans, or Brahmins, those priests of India, once so virtuous and so wise, they too had fallen. Those pupils of the Egyptian priests, the Phoenicians or Canaanites, who had taught the Israelites to sacrifice human beings and to pass their children through the fire to Moloch, infused the same bloodthirsty precepts among the Druids. As the Indian wife was burnt upon her husband's pyre, so on the corpses of the Celtic lords were consumed their children, their slaves, and their horses. But worse still, these wicked priests sought through the land for the most beautiful young women, and trained them to dance in the temples, and to entice the devotees to their arms with lustful attitudes and languishing looks. And with their voices, which mingled harmoniously with the golden bells suspended on their feet, they sang hymns to the gods in public, and in private enriched the treasuries of the pagoda with their infamous earnings. Thus a pure and simple religion was debased by the avarice and lewdness of its priests, till the temples became a den of thieves, till prostitution sat enthroned on the altars of the gods. A dark and dangerous heresy has long been creeping silently into the heart of our religion, and converting its ministers into false vipers, who, warmed and cherished by the bosom of this gentle church, use their increasing strength in darting black poison through all her veins. W. Winwood Reade, The Veil of Isis, echoing a sentiment held by a great many with regard to the subversion and degeneration of an ancient spiritual tradition. A tradition that seems to have once held such profound sway and influence across much of the world, to have once commanded such respect and admiration. So, what happened? The caste system, as a structure and framework for organizing and maintaining a healthy nation or community, is practically an omnipresent and universal concept throughout history, across time and space, especially in cases in which peoples and ways of life intermixed, such as the Indo-Aryans encountering the Dravidians in India, as a mechanism likely aimed, at least in part, at preserving some separation and maintaining order. The specific classes and roles varied, as did the strictness of implementation. But in contrast to our age, in which every individual is an unclassified entity, shooting off in a random, often ever-shifting direction of his own choosing, the caste structure was seen as a means of providing some direction and focus to more efficiently channel human energy, time, and attention. I'd like you to envision 4 castes. The first we'll call the caste of merchants, traders, and those who specialize in all things currency and trade related. The second we'll call the caste of workers, farmers, manufacturers, builders, etc. Those who do the hard work to keep a people fed, housed, clothed, and materially comfortable. The third we'll call the martial caste, devoted to the art of war and the cultivation of self-discipline, courage, and martial prowess, ideally as a means of defending one's people, culture, or nation, though equally capable of acting as a tool for conquest or domination of foreign lands. The fourth we'll call the priestly or teacher class, tasked with understanding this reality, our place within it, the nature of God and our relationship to this nature, and sharing and spreading this knowledge to facilitate a shared notion of who and what we are, of what our ideal roles are as human beings. And now that we have our 4 hypothetical castes broadly defined, a question. And to set the stage for the question, I hope we might be able to agree that each of these castes has an approximately ideal form. In other words, a healthy and net positive iteration and function, allowing them to efficiently fire on all cylinders in a focused manner, oriented toward the benefit of the entire population. But now let's try to envision the opposite, namely a corrupted and subverted version of each, in which they become unhealthy, net negative versions of themselves, and become organs of destruction or degeneration. In this case, which caste would be the most dangerous, the most harmful, or capable of producing lasting harmful effects? An argument could be made for each, certainly. In the first case, of merchants and traders, our modern age is living proof of just how much we're capable of debasing ourselves and life itself when this class becomes empowered and its most insatiably greedy cease to be reined in by any checks and balances, and an environment designed to inflame our most materialistic desires and passions and subsequently administer to our every whim is created. How devoting ourselves to the pursuit and attainment of the most superficial pleasures can so weaken and cheapen us. How otherwise decent people can be turned into salesmen and hucksters for products and services nobody really needs just to make ends meet. How the world, when turned into a mere marketplace, can quickly become a utilitarian environment in which quantity is prized over quality, style over substance, and everything is reduced to its purely economic bottom line. In the second case, of workers and laborers, perhaps the least compelling argument, in my opinion, though still an argument, a workforce might, for example, become unionized and united under corrupt individuals and institutions, and demand ever more in exchange for its labor, while competence and proficiency plummet, and the truly meritorious and exceptionally skilled are seen as annoyances or standing rebukes to the unified mediocre mass, and perhaps even shunned or banished. A culture of extreme disinterested laziness might come to predominate, as love for their nation fades, or as they begin to see the fruits of their labor fall squarely into the hands of a corrupt handful of individuals, and they lose connection to or resonance with the higher purpose of their role. The machinery of a nation can slowly but surely grind to a halt. In the third case, and the martial caste, unjust wars or vulgar displays of power for reasons of ego or material gain might lead to profound suffering and chaos, as armies become immensely powerful tools in the hands of immature souls with the most base instincts and desires. Slavery, forced cultural or religious conversions at the point of a sword, the unnatural redrawing of national borders, the unnatural mixing of populations that may have great mutual animosity or polar opposite cultures or ways of life, might guarantee chaos and unhappiness for generations to come. But in the fourth case, the teacher and priestly caste, a people's very understanding of the universe and their place within it, their understanding of God, of nature, of language, of history, might all be perverted and poisoned at a root level. Religions, belief structures, even gods might be created, destroyed, or even worse, incrementally tweaked, changed, and evolved according to how beneficial the resulting ideological doctrine might be to the leading members of this caste. And all of this accomplished behind layers of eloquent, elaborate, complex, and sophisticated speech and reasoning, providing just enough soothing, convincing, or intimidating power to stave off significant backlash or any serious threat to their power or influence. As you might have guessed, my own answer would be, confidently and unequivocally, that this fourth group, if subverted and corrupted, would be by far the greatest and most lasting danger. The highest of all possible dangers, in fact. This caste of priests, sages, teachers, or spiritual leaders are the crafters and cultivators of the ideas, the laws, and the underlying philosophies by which the rest of the nation operates, including the other castes to a great degree, at least in a healthy environment. Such men would be proactively looked to for such guidance and direction. Traditionally, their role was to speak to those highest and most fundamental concepts and laws that universally govern all of nature, not to dictate or impose, but rather clearly set out their ideas with an equally clear explanation of their roots and the why behind them, and in ideal circumstances, be such highly respected men that others then trust their judgment, discretion, and conclusions, and thus embrace said ideas and evolve their political, military, economic, and similar structures accordingly. Such men had immense power. An analogy that springs to mind is their being the guardians and custodians of a central wellspring of sorts, with the power to either discover and draw out pure, fresh spring water to nourish all around them, or to subtly introduce poisons, producing sickness and malady. You might be asking, why in the world might they resort to the latter? And I tend to believe the answer to this lies in the darker side of human nature, and is incredibly simple and straightforward: power. Such men have a choice between two paths, the first being a mere conduit of something higher, striving to be something like a pane of glass, as crystal clear and pure as is possible, through which light might shine. The role here is to be a messenger, a servant of the divine, a faithful interpreter or translator. The second path might be best described as being a twisted or distorted pane of glass, or a faulty and unfaithful interpreter. And it's here that a world of opportunities presents itself, opening the door for every possible manifestation of personal power. Picture being a messenger tasked by a faraway king to convey messages to his subjects. Picture just how tempting it might be to accidentally forget a word here or add a word there, or overemphasize or underemphasize a given term. Imagine the feeling of power, the amount of control and influence this would grant. Some historical background before we move on. One of the aspects of history I'm frequently speaking to and attempting to stress is the interconnectedness, specifically between 3000 BC and the birth of Christ, between peoples and nations and cultures and empires that modern historians seem to portray as distinct and unrelated. This was simply not the case. This time period was dominated not by numerous small factions separated by lines drawn on a map, but by what we might call dynastic lineages and their resulting racial and cultural lines of descent, which stretched across our modern notions of borders as if they were completely meaningless. These relationships and interconnections become especially obvious when we examine this priestly and teacher caste. There seems to be strong evidence of a relatively singular spiritual and philosophical tradition that subsequently spread across vast sections of the world, including India, Persia, Scythian and Gothic territory north of the Black Sea, across Europe, and into Britain and Ireland. Countless scholars have remarked on the incredible similarities between the Persian Avestas and the Indian Vedas, and even the Avestan language is incredibly similar to Sanskrit. Homer, especially in his Iliad, is extremely reminiscent of Indian epics, and both of these are similar to Norse sagas, and not just in style, but in substance. And these clearly related cultural and mythic traditions seem to have also shared similar teacher or priestly traditions. Law was absolutely central in ancient days, recognized as all-important, and is all-important. Law governs all things. The highest laws of nature and the universe are God's laws, encoded and seeded into all creation. The more we're able to understand them and act accordingly, the more we're in or of the light. In other words, the two dominant factors of ancient life were the law and the collective notion or understanding of the divine, and our relation to it as human beings. These two factors were so inexorably intertwined that essentially they were one. The greatest men of ancient days were almost always, quote, lawgivers, or those who codified sets of precepts to orient our manner of living. Manu and Menes, Solon, Moses and Muhammad, Lycurgus, Theodoric, and Alfred the Great. In many of these cases, Lycurgus in particular, it's suggested that close relationships and regular communications with the leaders of this priestly or teacher caste helped formulate this law. It should be noted that in Greek and Latin sources, the difference between a Magian, a Brahmin, and a Chaldean priest was said by multiple ancient historians to have been of no importance or significance. They're referenced as if they were all the same, springing from a singular category, although it was known that they were from 3 different regions, in Persia, India, and Assyria. They'd no doubt developed down different paths over the course of time, but at least initially, their activities seem practically interchangeable. And the same holds true for the Druids. Quote, although the term Druid is local, their religion was of deep root and a distant origin. It was of equal antiquity with those of the Persian Magi, the Chaldees of Assyria, and the Brahmans of Hindustan. It resembled them so closely in its sublime precepts, in its consoling promises, as to leave no doubt that these nations, living so widely apart, were all of the same stock and the same religion, that of Noah and the children of men before the flood. They worshipped but one God, and erected to him altars of earth or unhewn stone, and prayed to him in the open air, and believed in a heaven and a hell, and the immortality of the soul. It is strange that these offsprings of the patriarchs should also be corrupted from the same sources, and should thus still preserve a resemblance to one another in the minor tenets of their polluted creeds. End quote. And Clement of Alexandria states, philosophy, then, with all its blessed advantages to man, flourished long ago among the barbarians, diffusing its light among the Gentiles, and eventually penetrated into Greece. Its hierophants were the prophets among the Egyptians, the Chaldeans among the Assyrians, the Druids among the Galatians, the Sramanas of the Bactrians, and the philosophers of the Celts, the Magi among the Persians, who announced beforehand the birth of the Savior, being led by a star till they arrived in the land of Judea, and among the Indians, the Gymnosophists, and other philosophers of barbarous nations. There's even debate as to whether the source of these traditions originated in the West and spread to the East, or originated in the East and spread to the West. Scholar Edward Davies states, quote, an ingenious friend of mine suggested that this name I can't pronounce, or Menu of the 3 Veds, one of the masters of the mysterious and secret science among the Kimri, is the same character and personage with Menu, author of the Vedas. As to whether Britain or India was the initial home, Davies believed the region of Britain to be the likely origin point. This was evident in his treatment of the Indian ideas, apparently identifying Britain as a sacred land of the West, wherein was to be found the abode of the Petris, who were the fathers of the human race. And of course, Petris, being fathers of the human race, brings to mind and is undoubtedly cognate with the term patriarch. He insisted that the British location of the home of the Petris proved that reverence for the Petris, on the part of the Indians, had come from the religion of that race, in whose land those consecrated personages were acknowledged, uniformly, to have resided. And it's important to understand that Britain is simply a region being referred to, as it didn't exist as Britain, of course, in ancient times. A region which also contains Gotland and the primeval home of the Goths, Heligoland, Friesland, and possibly those poorly understood locales of Thule or Thule and Hyperborea. Godfrey Higgins, in his treatise The Celtic Druids, agrees on the interconnectedness of this ancient priesthood, but speaks of them as high priests who immigrated from India, and who were initially a colony from the first race of people, who he speaks of as survivors of a great flood who found sanctuary in the Himalaya. Higgins says, "These priesthoods were dedicated to the worship of God with such difference as there were between them, represented as variations on a theme, and as consequences of spatial and temporal distance." Scholar Reuben Burrow flatly insisted the Druids were Brahmins, quote, "beyond the least shadow of doubt." An Indian antiquities scholar, Thomas Maurice, wrote a dissertation on the Indian origins of the Druids and on the striking affinity which the religious rites and ceremonies anciently practiced in the British Islands bore to those of the Brahmins. The starting point of Maurice's discussion was the statement, quote, that the celebrated order of Druids were the immediate descendants of a tribe of Brahmins, which he also connects Tibet and the earliest Buddhists. Maurice claims etymological connection of Druid to the Celtic term for oak and similar Welsh variants, and connects it to the Sanskrit name for old Brahmins of the forest of the Gandharvas. Also speaks to the Brahmins being once called Durvasis, which he connects to the dervishes as a later outgrowth. In fact, it seems Magi may well be cognate with rabbi, and among others, the prophet Daniel in the book of the Bible was referred to both as chief of the Magi and the appellation Rabmag. And to speak frankly, it's my belief that the Talmudic rabbis of the modern age represent an extremely degenerated tradition of what it meant to play this role in the ancient world, to give some further idea of its purpose and function. Let's first examine the etymology of this fascinating, important term. Magi is connected to magic and magicians, to mage and magus, and is likely connected to a term Maju, used by at least one Arab historian, from the Arab perspective, as a blanket term to describe all Norse or Nordic individuals by the Andalusians, perhaps because he came to generically associate fairer-skinned racial stock with these teachers and priests, though this is largely speculation and guesswork on my part. Magni, Maga, and Magoi are related labels, and the words magnify and magnificent and magistrate. The root of the word seems to trace back to the Proto-Indo-European mag, meaning to be able, have power, as well as many similar derivative root words and concepts across the many branches of the Aryan and Indo-European language family. In the Vedas, Indra has many epithets, notably Magavan, meaning magnanimous, greatly efficient. Sanskrit Mahatma, magnate or great-souled, comes from the same root. It seems that these magi were the faction with the power to shape, direct, change, channel, to speak things into being. And in fact, initially the word seems to have much to do with speech, song, and the power of the word. The oldest surviving reference to the Magi comes from the poetic Gathas. In the sacred verse of the Gathas, the term Mag refers to the great mastery of spiritual and mental powers, and the powers of mind or spirit to manifest. In their earliest days, the Magi seem to be the scholarly or priestly class of ancient Aryans founded by Zarathustra, sometimes called Zoroaster, descended from the Spidaman or Spidamid family or clan, with spit in Avesta meaning brilliant or white. To quote from AuthenticGathaZoroastrianism.org, the term Magi denotes the fellowship of the learned masters, founded by the ancient Aryan prophet Zarathustra. The Magi were followers of Zarathustra, or followers of what the Hellenistic world later associated with Zarathustra. They were most knowledgeable considering consciousness and mind, and believed that consciousness and mind is the magical substance, or stuff, out of which universe, with all of its marvelous hidden dimensions and powers, is made. Initially, this widespread priestly caste seemed to be heavily associated with the wearing of all white robes made of fine linen, the traveling to all corners of the world, the sharing and bestowing of law and judgment and order and spiritual wisdom. Jordanus, in his Getica, tells us, "Then Philip, the father of Alexander the Great, made alliance with the Goths and took to wife Medopa, the daughter of King Gudilla, so that he might render the kingdom of Macedon more secure by the help of this marriage. It was at this time, as the historian Dio relates, that Philip, suffering from need of money, determined to lead out his forces and sack Odessus, a city of Moesia, which was then subject to the Goths by reason of the neighboring city of Tomi. Thereupon those priests of the Goths that are called the Holy Men suddenly opened the gates of Odessus and came forth to meet them. They bore harps and were clad in snowy robes, and chanted in suppliant strains to the gods of their fathers, that they might be propitious and repel the Macedonians. When the Macedonians saw them coming with such confidence to meet them, they were astonished, and, so to speak, the armed were terrified by the unarmed. Straightway they broke the line they had formed for battle, and not only refrained from destroying the city, but even gave back those who they had captured outside by right of war. Then they made a truce and returned to their own country." End quote. And William Reed says the following with regard to the ancient bards, who seem to spring from this same tradition. Quote, "Also that they did their utmost to stay those civil wars which were the bane of Britain, and that often when two fierce armies had stood fronting each other in array of battle, their swords drawn, their spears pointing to the foe, and waiting but for the signal from their chieftains to begin the conflict, the bards had stepped in between them and touched their harps with such harmony, and so persuaded them with sweet thrilling verses, that suddenly, on either side, soldiers had dropped their arms and forgotten the fierce resentment which had been raging in their breasts." End quote. This group seems to have been heavily associated with a specific instrument, the cithara, so often mentioned in descriptions of the Hyperboreans and the Goths. Diodorus Siculus tells us, quote, "Furthermore, a city is there which is sacred to this god, and the majority of its inhabitants are players on the cithara, and these continually play on this instrument in the temple, and sing hymns of praise to the god, glorifying his deeds." End quote. Regarding the Goths, Jordanus in the Getica tells us, "In the earliest times they sang the deeds of their ancestors in strains of song accompanied by the cithara." Over time, I've come to believe the Hyperboreans were almost certainly a real people being referenced, and in fact, they seem to well fit the profile of these traveling wise men. Much like the people spoken of in the Oralinda book, an aloof and thus poorly understood, yet highly respected, mysterious group of outsiders, said to come from a land of plenty where justice and virtue prevailed, who seem to have wielded a great deal of influence in the earliest stages of the most powerful and influential nations and empires of old. Diodorus Siculus continues, "The Hyperboreans also have a language which is peculiar to them, and are most friendly disposed towards the Greeks, and especially towards the Athenians and Delians, who have inherited this goodwill from most ancient times. The myth also relates that certain Greeks visited the Hyperboreans and left behind them there costly votive offerings bearing inscriptions in Greek letters. This seems to have been a class or caste of individuals that played leading roles in guiding the growth and development of much of the ancient world, sometimes ruling, sometimes exercising a controlling influence behind the scenes or from a distance, often with kings and governors as their administrators. At first, it seems benevolently, but consider just how easily such a structure might go horribly awry. And consider the possibility that the world in which we're currently living couldn't be a more perfect example of this going awry. Quote, "The priests invented 1,000 gods. The priests told 1,000 lies. The priests instituted 1,000 absurd and horrible customs. Who first taught nations to be idolaters, to be murderers, but the priests? Who instituted the festival of the Juggernaut, the Inquisition, the massacre of St. Bartholomew, but the priests? Calvin, a priest of the Reformation, ordered his victims to be burnt with green wood, a truly Christian refinement of cruelty. Aaron, a priest, manufactured a golden calf and taught the Israelites to insult their God. And it was Caiaphas, a high priest, who committed that murder of which the more virtuous heathen Pilate washed his hands. Look everywhere, and you will see the priests reeking with gore. They have converted popular and happy nations into deserts, and have made our beautiful world into a slaughterhouse, drenched with blood and tears." End quote. One of the first to mention them was Herodotus, who uses the term Magi in two different senses. In the first sense, Herodotus speaks of the Magi as one of the tribes or peoples of the Medes. He speaks of the Magians offering sacrifices and libations in ancient Troy, and speaks of the Persians thinking idols and shrines to be folly, only worshipping a single all-father figure on mountaintops. In another sense, he uses the term Magi to generically refer to a sacerdotal caste, but, quote, whose ethnic origin is never again so much as mentioned. According to Robert Charles Zahner, in other accounts, quote, "We hear of Magi not only in Persia, Parthia, Bactria, Chorasmia, Aria, Media, and among the Sakas, but also in non-Iranian lands like Samaria, Ethiopia, and Egypt. Their influence was also widespread throughout Asia Minor. It is, therefore, quite likely that the sacerdotal caste of the Magi was distinct from the Median tribe of the same name. They're most often described as scholars and priests, fire kindlers and keepers of ancient flames, serving as advisors, councils, or administrators at the royal court, being consulted as interpreters of dreams and omens. The fact that the term Magi seemed to become both a racial or ethnic category, as well as a caste or occupational category, may help explain some of the confusion in the historical record, and there certainly is incredible confusion. It's fascinating how aggressively contradictory the descriptions are through the ages, and this applies to both the Magi and the Druids. Some, especially in the most ancient references, seem to hold them in the highest possible regard. The famous Macedonian philosopher Aristotle of Stagira, who had spent a good part of his life in ancient Iran's western territories, states explicitly that the Magians neither know nor practice black magic or sorcery. Other Greek sources from before the Hellenistic period include the gentleman soldier Xenophon, who had first-hand experience at the Persian Achaemenid court. In his early 4th century BC Cyropedia, Xenophon, who visited the Achaemenid Empire in 401, depicts the Magians as authorities in all religious matters, and imagines the Magians to be responsible for the education of the emperor-to-be. He calls the Magians experts in everything scholarly. He also states that the Magians sing hymns to the rising sun and all divine powers. And yet others, for example the respectable Pliny the Elder, speak of them only with disgust, in much the same way that the Oralinda book seems to when it speaks of the corrupt priestly leaders of the Gauls. It's said that Pythagoras, Empedocles, Democritus, Heraclitus, and Plato traveled abroad to study with the Magi. Yet this very same Heraclitus is said to have, quote, directed his prophecies against the wanderers of the night, the Magians, the Bacchantes, the Maenads, and Initiates. Heraclitus threatens them with tortures after death. He threatens them with fire. For what they believe to be initiations in the mysteries are, in fact, impious rites. This is thought to be the first time the word Magians was used negatively. Later authors would lump the expression together with words like witch kings and sorcerers. Their history bears all the hallmarks of a degenerated spiritual tradition, and I've come to believe that the key to truly understanding much of the past and the present lies in the unpacking and comprehending the path of this subversion and degeneration. Most of you may be familiar with the term Magi from its most widely used iteration, referencing the three Magi, which tellingly is also translated as kings and wise men, who are said to have traveled to attend the birth of Jesus. And in fact, one of the non-canonical Christian sources, the Syriac Infancy Gospel, provides, in its 3rd chapter, a story of the wise men of the East, which is very similar to much of the story in Matthew. This account cites Zoroaster as the source of the prophecy that motivated the wise men to seek the infant Jesus. In the biblical story, we have, by all accounts, respectable Magi, so obviously from an Indo-Aryan spiritual tradition, closely connected to that of both India and Persia of the day, traveling a great distance to offer gifts to the newborn Jesus. And simultaneously, we have Herod, the Edomite or Idumean, issuing the edict to massacre infants to destroy a perceived threat and preserve his power. This Edomite or Idumean lineage, a decidedly non-Israelite people, grafted onto the Judean branch of the Israelites due to their forced conversion by Hasmonean ruler John Hyrcanus, would go on to dominate the temple and help foster the subsequent Talmudic rabbinical tradition. To those that believe this massacre of infants to be mere historical invention, and of course we can never know such things with 100% certainty, I encourage you to dig deeper into the known history of Herod and his family and his resulting lineage. Such a massacre wouldn't be the least bit out of character, to put it mildly. Herod is, beyond any doubt, and from every root historical source I've been able to locate, one of the most objectively foul creatures in the entire historical record. A man who would go on to murder much of his own family, among a litany of other crimes of the most ignoble sort. It's mentioned that a leading reason for the massacre of infants was due to these very Magi refusing to return to him because they clearly mistrusted the man and his ultimate intentions to provide the location of the newborn Jesus. And, quote, "Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and set forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men." Herod failed to end Jesus' life in infancy, but Caiaphas, the rabbi, high priest, and Pharisee, would later succeed, though not before a message and doctrine was conveyed to the world, one that would go on to reverberate throughout the ages. And yet, at the same time, not one completely immune to being compromised or reshaped by this now thoroughly corrupted priestly caste. Because Jesus, in his day, was so clearly seen as a teacher by all who encountered him, when these various traditions speak of claimed visits to their region, they speak of him in different ways. Brahmin or Buddha in the Indian tradition, Yogi in the Tibetan tradition. There's even an inscription dating to 521 AD from a St. Columba in the Abbey at Iona, Scotland, stating, "My druid is Jesus." It's seemingly impossible to know the definitive truth behind these claims of visitation, but it does provide further evidence supporting the idea that the various classes within this broader priestly caste don't seem to be as separate and distinct as modern scholarship often takes them to be, at least as far as the distant past is concerned, as time and distance has a way of widening and hardening these distinctions and delineations. The Oralinda book, too, speaks highly of a personage that may well have been Jesus. And one of the things that so fascinates me about the OLB is just how well and how accurately, to my mind, it frames the real historical struggle behind the scenes. Namely, how it frames the ongoing fight between genuine sages and holy or virtuous men, and a deeply corrupted subset of merely ambitious, power-mad men, lurking behind the masks of priests and holy men, whose real aim is simply power. While Jesus warned his followers to be as harmless as doves, yet as wise as serpents, this priestly caste of men, as the world degraded, seemed intent on cultivating the harmless as doves mentality to its utmost among those they controlled, while utterly monopolizing the wise as serpents philosophy to themselves and their small subset. It can be argued that there is a valid reason to keep the most sacred knowledge out of the hands of men who might cheapen or defame it. This is a power that comedy possesses, for example. A man can take the most weighty and profound conception and flippantly mock and deride it to the laughing mob to rob it of all sanctity and power. But secrecy is always a double-edged sword, and as history proves, almost inevitably leads to disaster. Few people truly grasp the power of secret societies. When they operate in the midst of unaware populations, they always win out. It's simply inevitable. Organization and allied action beats out the lack of these every time. To use Masonry as a modern example, we now have hundreds of thousands of opportunistic men, many of whom were perhaps drawn in for positive reasons, all mutually assisting one another covertly across the vast majority of the civilized world. And yet none of them, except for perhaps a handful at the very top of this pyramid of power and control, know exactly who or what it is that they serve. Many hear some positive language about brotherhood of man, helping, being good, and for them this is sufficient, especially when coupled with the promises of career advancement and material gain. There couldn't be a more perfect recipe for covert control on a mass scale, and all is made possible due to this veil of secrecy and lack of transparency. And coupled with secrecy, the degeneration of this lofty tradition was both hastened and marked by a ridiculous shift in focus, as the emphasis moved from a relatively pure, clear, and laconic notion of law, of what it meant to be righteous and walk the holy path, to a sprawling and complex doctrine, and began to incorporate often absurd ritual actions. The Druids would tell their followers, quote, "The samulos which grew in damp places was to be gathered by a person fasting, without looking behind him, and with his left hand." Or, "The vervain was to be gathered at the rise of the dog star, neither sun nor moon shining at the time. It was to be dug tip with an iron instrument, and to be waved aloft in the air, the left hand only being used." Advice that calls to mind the Talmudic passages that suggest other clever rituals one might do to be sure they stayed on the right side of God. What all of this represents is ritual and minutiae, which acted as a superimposed overlay atop the more pure and fundamental doctrine, often acting as loopholes, allowing a person to essentially get away with sins or actions the rest of us might consider abhorrent or unjust, as long as they pat their head in such and such a manner or spin in X number of circles. All of it functions as a means for men to change and alter traditional and generational laws and precepts through clever interpretation and subjective elaboration, and subtly replace the more ancient and timeless conceptions with their own. And again, to my mind, this brings to the fore the words of warning from Jesus that set him at such loggerheads with the Pharisaical priesthood of his day. In fact, there's a fair amount of evidence pointing to the fact that Jesus may have essentially been a Nazarene Essene. His brother James, early leader of the Jerusalem church, who was stoned to death by a Herodian high priest, is said to have been the leader of the Jerusalem Essenes. And it seems very likely that John the Baptist, who speaks of Pharisees as a brood of vipers, was as well, with the baptism ritual itself being identical to that of the Essenes. The historian Josephus, who as a general rule should be taken with a grain of salt, said something intriguing on a topic he'd have no reason to lie about. Of the three major sects, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, he states that only the Essenes were Judean Israelites by birth, and goes on to say that they practice a more severe and strict discipline, and that they seem to have far greater mutual affection for one another. Similar to so many Indo-Aryan spiritual traditions, the Essenes were said to start their day with a prayer of supplication to the sun's rising. But as in so many cases of fire or sun, quote, worship, this doesn't seem to be worship of the substance itself, but rather was their symbolic means of honoring God via the most potent physical and visible manifestation of his power and glory. And to this day, followers of Christ keep Sunday holy as their Sabbath, in contrast to other peoples, for example modern Jews, whose Sabbath is on Saturday, or Saturn's Day. The Essenes are said to have referred to the Pharisees as shoddy fence builders or wall builders, seemingly a reference to their inability or unwillingness to stand apart and separate themselves from the evils of this world. And Nazarene seems to derive from the Aramaic natsar, meaning to guard or watch. They don't seem to have been aggressive evangelists, seeking to forcibly spread their doctrine to foreign peoples. Instead, their relatively isolated and insulated communities allowed them to keep their doctrine, culture, and way of life relatively pure and unchanging, allowing them to lead by the example communicated through their exemplary lives. The idea many modern scholars and historians seem to have of the Essenes being some minor sect, localized in both time and space around the birth of Jesus, seems to run completely contrary to historical accounts. Josephus states that the Essenes had existed since time immemorial. Philo agrees, calling Essenes the most ancient of all initiates, with a teaching perpetuated through an immense space of ages. Pliny spoke of them as a race of their own, more remarkable than any other in the world, the oldest of the initiates, receiving their teaching from Central Asia, a teaching perpetuated through an immense space of ages, constant and unalterable holiness. This reference to Central Asia as a source of their teaching is fascinating, and similar to the Scythians, specifically the very few bits of information we have about the mysterious so-called royal Scythians, they practiced a strikingly similar form of communal living, banished slavery, practiced beekeeping, and had honey as a staple portion of their diet, and multiple accounts speak of them being extraordinarily robust and physically strong, and routinely living to ages of 90 or 100 and beyond. Several scholars also believe they see a connection to India, with some going so far as to claim they were essentially Buddhists. It seems to be a case of so many free-flowing connections between racially and culturally related peoples and spiritual practices that using any strict modern label in attempting to quantify the Essenes and their doctrine seems not just difficult, but unhelpful and inaccurate here. Their origin is lost in prehistory, but they're said to have been active as far back in recorded history as the 18th century BC in Egypt. They seem to have called themselves the Sons of Light, or Sons of the Sun, and viewed the spiritual struggle of mankind as one of light versus darkness, in a manner that bears striking similarities to the original Zoroastrian doctrine. Although the sect clustered around Mount Carmel has become the best known to historians of our day, they're said to have lived in small, insulated communities spread across much of the ancient world, and were said to have practiced and become exceptionally good at farming, not merely to sustain themselves, but seemingly almost as an extension of their meditative spiritual practice, of their emphasis on positive creation, growth, or the flowering of life in the face of darkness and death, and a conscious focus on simplicity and uncomplicated living. They seem to have embraced, and perhaps even been the source of, the old adage, cleanliness is next to godliness, across every sphere. Physical cleanliness, cleanliness of immediate surroundings or their community, cleanliness and purity of thought and action, and in fact their entire life philosophy seemed geared toward the banishment of poisons. Like the original pre-subversion Zoroastrian priests, or Magi, or Druids, or Brahmins, or Buddhas, they seem to have been universally viewed as healers, as tasked with combating physical and mental and spiritual sickness and confusion, and working to establish right order in the world, and seem to have been one and the same with the group known as the Therapeutai. In a sense, they seem to see themselves as something like white magicians, or a brotherhood of light, contrasted with and directly opposing dark magicians, and the insidious poisons they so freely spread. I spoke earlier of Herod and the Idumean Edomite takeover of the temple. When this is coupled with their aggressive persecution of Jesus, and Jesus' direct warning multiple times to take heed, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, one can't help but wonder if there's more than meets the eye at first glance here. There also exists a seemingly explosive yet little discussed piece of correspondence dating from approximately 300 BC between a high priest in Judea, Jonathan, to the Spartans. Quote, "To our brothers in Sparta, greetings. At an earlier time, your king Arius sent a letter to our high priest Onias, stating that our two nations are related, as the attached copy shows. Onias received your ambassador with full honors and acknowledged receipt of your letter, which declared our alliance and friendship. And now, although we are not in need of such alliances, since we find our source of strength in the holy books we possess, we have written to renew our ties of brotherhood and friendship with you. We do not wish to become total strangers, and it has now been many years since your last communication." End quote. There's a great deal to unpack and discuss on these topics, and this video isn't the place for that, but it seems clear to me that the earliest priestly caste in and around Israel certainly wasn't wholly isolated and disconnected from the surrounding peoples and cultures, and that this priestly element, much like the related Magi and Brahmin and Druids, seemed to degenerate and change profoundly over the years, as a very different human type rose to prominence within their ranks. The reason I so often speak of the warrior and martial caste with respect, and tend to consider them healthier in overall orientation, is because of the four hypothetical castes mentioned. It's this one that seems to have the greatest natural immune system, the greatest innate inborn resistance to those that might wish to deceive and subvert. Such subversive personalities are almost always cowards, and weak men who prefer subterfuge and sophistry. These skill sets, fully cultivated and cleverly wielded, can accomplish a great deal, especially among the merchant or priestly castes. But a laconic Spartan or Scythian warrior, for example, would likely remain unmoved. I've come to believe that this is, at least in part, why those nations or cultures with martial traditions at their core seem to have retained far more of that ancient ethos, and a more healthy and robust orientation. And this leads us to an important point. In an ideal environment, similar to that type hinted at in descriptions of the ancient Scythian or Goth or Phrygian or Hyperborean, there must be practically no animosity or mistrust between the castes. And in fact, this seems to be a necessity if a people seek to thrive. And perhaps as importantly, though this may just be another way of saying the same thing, they can't be wholly disconnected from one another, lacking understanding of one another, or completely lacking the positive traits and characteristics of one another. As Thucydides well put it, the society that separates scholars from warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools. The caste structure was designed with the intent that each group would be complementary to all others, understanding and respectful of other castes' place, purpose, and role, and never fully divorced from their mindset or their ideals. Our teachers, sages, and priests, this most important and powerful of all castes, seemed to stumble so profoundly astray when a smaller, more envious and pretentious breed of man began to rise to prominence, and everywhere sought to draw a very deep dividing line between its class and the others, more and more demanding a master and slave relationship, ironically, as they became less and less deserving of the title master. The moment this began to happen, the healthier and better oriented among them seemed to have slowly but surely gravitated out of the priestly caste, fleeing the scene or seeking entry into other castes, causing the corruption problem in the priestly caste to become exponentially worse, until finally it found itself largely composed of egotistical schemers seeking personal advantage and dominance, and in fact becoming experts in the art. In the earliest days, as Jordanus and Siculus both mention in their histories, these priestly men seem to have led by example, and by producing feelings of awe and admiration in those around them, not by forcible compulsion or demand. We hear of them swaying entire armies, arrayed for battle, adrenaline flowing through their veins, entirely due to the respect felt for them. In many cases, in fact, these holy men seem to have been proven and capable warriors themselves, and this is likely why it wasn't difficult for the more martially minded to consider them brothers, to treat them with immense respect and take them seriously. But when, across the stretch of time and generations, they began to separate themselves, and even make a great show of separating themselves, and, like Talmudic rabbis or late-stage druids, began to so prize their subjective intellect that they viewed themselves akin to gods, and their subject population as cattle, it becomes easy to see how such major splits and rifts have occurred so frequently throughout history. Of course, we're all capable of evil, of being fueled by purely selfish and egotistical motives as we navigate our existence. As Solzhenitsyn so well put it, the battle line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man. And I'm sure we're all familiar with the saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. It takes an extremely unique type of human being to exercise this office or role with selfless devotion, and seems to require almost as prerequisite cultural conditions capable of cultivating such a man, or even shaping a populace capable of discerning who he is in the first place. Solzhenitsyn also said, and this is such an important conception here that it might be seen as a theme underlying this entire video, quote, "Everything you add to the truth subtracts from the truth," echoing that laconic wisdom our ancestors seem to so clearly grasp and understand, and illustrating the path taken by these false wise men, these sophists and magicians and spinners of words, as they created layer after layer of their own wildly subjective and speculative intellectual musings atop a far more pure and simple tradition. And once again, I think etymology holds some clues here. We often use the word wholesome, and it's a truly great word to describe deeply positive and healthy things. Whole and wholeness represent totality in balance, completion. The word holistic is similar. And, of course, the word holy. Absolute truth, the highest truth, is expressed in this whole, a seeking to glimpse, grasp, and understand the totality to the best of our limited and fallible abilities. Reductionist science represents an attempt to cobble together a sprawling picture of the most technical minutiae of our existence, seemingly believing that this sprawling data or knowledge picture might then sufficiently explain our reality. But this seems a bit like believing you might understand a great movie by reading the script, or a sporting event by looking at the box score, or a masterful painting by examining it with a microscope. Facts are merely cold and clinical little data points. Everything valuable, everything interesting, and everything of great worth seems to exist above and beyond them, the as yet unknowable connective tissue. What seems to have originated so long ago as a caste of men who purposefully lived austere lives of self-sacrifice, devoting themselves to the task of attaining a deeper understanding of our world in order to positively guide and shape it, had everywhere devolved into something very different. Instead of serving God and the people, they found ingenious methods to become the gods of the people and make them their slaves. I'm reminded of the quote from Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, essentially stating that others were born to serve them, or the similar rabbinical statements indicating that a future goal is outright enslavement. And they're not alone here. Jesuit and Masonic orders, several prominent and likely interconnected secret societies, the Vatican, all seem to epitomize the bad shepherd, and seem to seek a future in which their dominance and control is complete and unquestionable, and one in which natural and higher law might be fully transgressed whenever it suits their aims. It may even be fair to say that this very transgression is their aim. I think it's noteworthy that Reuben Burrow, who I quoted earlier, rejected the possibility that the Druids had been killed and their knowledge lost, suggesting that, quote, it is much more likely that they turned schoolmasters and Freemasons and fortune-tellers, end quote. Examine the political, ideological, and philosophical leanings of these groups, and you'll find virtually no conflict between them. You'll also find that they're all increasingly backing a singular religion, though they'll never call it by that word, intended to operate above and beyond all others. The religion of science. Modern science, ironically operating from the greatest of all faith-based conceptions, in its insistence that there definitively exists no creator or higher power, subsequently masquerades as this ultimate authority itself, with its direct equivalents of druids and rabbis and Magis as the self-professed expert class, a class which seems to have completely and utterly lost its connection to the source, marching about like self-important children, wearing their parents' clothes, making definitive and declaratory judgments everywhere they go, and yet failing miserably time and time and time again. They're utterly lost, and because they're the governing force in our world, they threaten to drag the rest of us with them. A degenerated tradition, degraded very nearly beyond any hope of repair. Many still think of science as if it's a tireless and objective pursuit of truth, of reliable and trustworthy data and information on which we might build a better and clearer understanding of our world. And there were periods of history in which it seemed to be something approximating this. Europe, prior to the World Wars, seems an excellent example. The most brilliant minds in the world, devoted to discovering new plant and animal species and understanding their attributes, exploring and exhaustively studying our oceans and skies. Many true geniuses with boundless curiosity and self-discipline enough to not overstep or take wild leaps, but to move forward in a sober, disciplined, apolitical manner. These were true intellectuals, a descriptor that once meant something real, and I believe this was a period of true progress, yet another word that has been made all but meaningless, with regard to furthering our understanding of the world around us. As the forces of international banking and finance triumphed in these world wars, and as they instituted their central banks and the Federal Reserve, and began controlling and printing the pieces of paper nearly every man, woman, and child on the planet strives to earn and spend, the institutions of science, like every other meaningful or powerful or influential institution, began to gradually change shape and become something very different. For the first time since the inception of universities and colleges, their doors are now wide open to the most mediocre minds, and merit itself has ceased to be a yardstick almost entirely. They've become credential mills, whose foremost requirement is that the individual believes what these hidden hands of our new status quo want them to believe, that they're willing to act as dutiful apostles for this new dogma. Science, accordingly, has gone from fascinating and thought-provoking studies, including those speaking to the differences between races, cultures, nations, or genders, to, quote, proving race doesn't exist, proving gender doesn't exist, proving that Western culture and mankind are responsible for the ills of the world, that COVID is a rampaging and deadly pandemic, that vaccines and masks will prevent contracting or spreading the disease. In short, science can now, quote, prove virtually anything. In a world now overflowing with information, with an uncountable number of possible data points to pull from to make one's case, it's as simple as finding the handful that paint the idea one wishes to sell in the best light, and then weaving them together in an attractive and compelling manner. Science is now the malleable, adaptable chameleon that now only masquerades as a coldly logical, rational, hard-nosed, and unswerving seeker of truth. In an environment in which belief in a creator has been slowly but surely torn to shreds, and perhaps even more importantly, painted in a negative, shameful light more often than not, that subset of the public seeking to be seen as fashionable or intelligent or well-educated can't help but naturally and instinctively flock to this new dogma, this new faith-based religion, which so effectively and dishonestly pretends to be above leaps of faith, above those silly, ignorant, backward people with the nerve to hold beliefs similar to those of essentially every single great genius across every single generation that came before us. For what it's worth, I propose that this masterful sleight of hand is essentially an act of magic. And as with any good magician, the trick only retains its immense power when the observer doesn't know how it's done. Illusion, deception, manipulation, and subterfuge. These are the hallmarks of our modern-day Magi, who've refined their dark art over the generations to such a degree that the vast majority of their handiwork even still remains unnoticed, behind screens of puppets, fronts, masks, all the while using every means at their disposal to maintain control over the incentivization and punishment structure, broadly speaking, to take full advantage of an atomized public increasingly seeking their own immediate self-interest, lured into slumber by bread and circuses. The French Revolution marked one of many major turning points, setting the stage for the sickly environment we face today. The rallying and stoking of the mob into a maddened, murderous rage before pointing them toward the ancient nobility and aristocracy to utterly decimate their ranks. Or Cromwell in England, or the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and the brutal murder of the entire Romanov line to settle an ancient score. These movements that took such pains to portray themselves as populist people's movements against oppressive elites in actuality functioned as the means to open the door for something far, far darker. For decades, we've been bombarded with horror stories about the dangers of the, quote, strongman, or of monarchy. And those victors, authoring the history books, have sought to portray these men and their forms of government as the root of all evil. Meanwhile, near absolute power has everywhere been transferred from these patriarchs and their descendants and into the hands of banking families and their dutiful little army of collaborators and bought men, behind the mask of lofty notions like democracy or capitalism or equal representation, facades of fairness and justice, Moloch and Mammon in a mask. I spoke in a previous video about how races, cultures, or nations essentially shape themselves over time. like manifested archetypal representations of the collective, fostering and cultivating their own unique set of strengths and weaknesses, unique spheres of dominance or blind spots. I'd ask you to entertain the possibility of a unique culture of individuals who now represent the end product of an intergenerational Machiavellian self-authoring of sorts, in which they're not striving to be the most intelligent or creative and artistic, inventive or otherwise capable, not seeking to better the world or find ways to make it more organized, stable, secure, happy, or healthy, but rather focusing entirely, exclusively, solely on obtaining a dominant position by any means necessary. Let's even pretend, for the sake of argument, that such a collective group or culture didn't exist, but rather only individuals of this type existed, here and there, scattered throughout the world. Do you think such types might eventually find one another, might find common cause and common ground, form alliances, and begin to quietly work with each other toward common goals? And if this occurred, do you think you would know? There's a reason great men have always found secrecy, especially on the world stage or with regard to politics, to be repugnant. Conspiracies are inherently dishonest, and no leader who loves his people would have reason to lurk in the shadows or seek to break in through the back door. Such men would have nothing to hide, because their intentions are pure, simple, and straightforward. Our current power brokers found creative ways to slaughter entire generations of such men, their families, supporters, and ideological and cultural kin. In the 2 world wars, millions of courageous and principled men were robbed of their very existence, their blood turned into fertilizer in the fields of Europe, while the coffers of these men lurking in the shadows exploded. Proceeds they then used, in part, to bring to power a new, more tame and more domesticated and domesticatable type of mankind, and thus incrementally and slowly but surely the noose tightened ever further. So were the Magi, the Druids, the Brahmin, and similar orders good or bad? Seems to me a question impossible to answer, because I think it's the wrong question, and a flawed question, because they haven't been a static, unchanging entity across time. A more informative question might be, how have they changed, morphed, and evolved over the millennia? And does our modern priestly or teacher caste now bear any resemblance to those lofty figures from the dawn of human history? Or might we be dealing with imposters, a purposefully subverted and consciously degenerated and degraded tradition, opening the door for the covert rule of a type of mankind that could never attain or retain such absolute power in the transparent light of day? Has our distracted negligence and inattention allowed dark magicians to grasp the reins? And if so, is there still enough light in the world to truly banish this darkness and unseat them?